For decades, China called itself the world's factory. Container ships loaded with goods, cargo planes packed to the ceiling, production lines running day and night, all to feed one customer, America. But what happens when that customer walks away? This is not a trade slowdown. This is not a dip in demand. This is a shutdown. Container bookings on the China-US route have collapsed by 45%. Air freight routes between the two nations frozen. Ports once buzzing with activity now sit eerily quiet. And behind the scenes, Beijing is quietly slashing tariffs on American products. Not as a power move, but as a desperate plea. A silent admission. We can't survive without you. The question now isn't whether China can rebuild trust. The question is whether the world's factory can survive at all without the American buyer. It didn't happen overnight, but when the shift began, it moved fast. Factories across China, once running 3 shifts a day, started going dark. Production lines that fed America's insatiable appetite for cheap goods were now silent. Forklifts sat parked. Warehouse shelves stacked high with unsold products. Workers sent home with no pay. The numbers tell the story. Bookings for container shipments from China to the United States collapsed by 45%. Ports like Ningbo and Shanghai, the lifeblood of China's export machine, reported cargo volumes dropping to historic lows. Air freight demand on China-US routes plummeted by more than 30%. In some weeks, entire flights were canceled. At the port of Los Angeles, once crowded with incoming Chinese shipments, the docks are clearing. The backlog is gone. Not because of efficiency, but because the flow has dried up. This wasn't caused by a global recession. It wasn't a supply chain bottleneck. It was the direct result of one policy decision: President Trump's 145% tariff wall. Overnight, the products China depended on selling, electronics, plastics, furniture, machine parts, became too expensive to compete. Buyers in America didn't just hesitate. They canceled orders. Some turned to Vietnam, India, or Mexico. Others simply held off, waiting out the uncertainty. But the damage to China was immediate. Factories that had spent years, sometimes decades, designing their entire production around U.S. demand were suddenly left stranded. Finished goods piled up, warehouses filled, cargo ships floated idle at anchor, and the desperation showed. In Guangdong, a mid-sized electronics manufacturer revealed off the record, "We had contracts for 100,000 units this quarter, but after the tariffs hit, the orders were canceled. Completely gone. We have stock we can't move and loans we can't pay." They're not alone. Across China's industrial zones, in Shenzhen, Ningbo, Dongguan, the story repeats. Factories shuttered. Managers scrambling to find buyers anywhere they can. Some tried to reroute their products through Canada or Mexico, hoping to dodge the tariffs through backdoor transshipment. But U.S. Customs was ready for that. Inspections tightened, rules enforced, loopholes closed. The result? China's export machine, the same machine that once flooded the U.S. with low-cost goods, began choking on its own output. Desperate to keep the game alive, Beijing quietly made a move they hoped no one would notice. They started slashing tariffs on certain U.S. imports, especially critical products like semiconductors, medical equipment, and aerospace parts. A silent white flag, a quiet admission. They need America more than America needs them. But even that wasn't enough, because the buyers weren't just reacting to prices. They were reacting to risk. The risk of building supply chains on unstable ground. The risk of counting on a partner whose biggest customer could walk away at any moment. Trump's tariff wall didn't just raise costs. It exposed China's greatest weakness: dependence. The American buyer had become the lifeline of China's economy. And once that lifeline was cut, the reality hit hard. The factories are still there. The machines still work. But the orders are gone. And the world's factory, the powerhouse that claimed it could dominate global trade, now faces the one scenario it never prepared for: life without the American customer. China always had a plan B, at least that's what they claimed. When the Trump administration launched the tariff war, Beijing's officials stood in front of the cameras. declaring that China would simply shift focus to other markets: Africa, Latin America, Southeast Asia, domestic demand. But behind closed doors, the reality was very different. Because the Chinese export machine wasn't built for flexibility. It was built for one thing: volume. And the only customer big enough to absorb that volume was the United States. Here's why it matters. China's factories aren't small workshops. They're massive production lines optimized for scale, locked into specific designs, certifications, and components that fit the US market. From electronics to plastics to industrial parts, these products were tailored to meet American standards, consumer tastes, and pricing. Switching overnight to sell those goods elsewhere? Not an option. The logistics alone are a nightmare. Production schedules, supplier contracts, quality certifications, all hardwired into an infrastructure designed for America. But it gets worse. The raw materials that feed these factories? Many come from American or Western suppliers. Semiconductors, specialized chemicals, aerospace-grade components. Without these inputs, the production lines can't run. When Trump raised tariffs on finished goods, Beijing quietly responded, not with strength, but with desperation. They started cutting tariffs on certain American imports: semiconductor chips, medical devices, aerospace parts. The message was clear, even if they never said it out loud. We can't build without your parts. This is the supply chain trap. The more China tried to break free from US dependence, the more they exposed how deep that dependence runs. Their plan B markets? Too small, too fragmented. Even if China shifted some goods toward Africa or Southeast Asia, the scale didn't come close to what they lost from the United States. And even when they tried to reroute shipments, moving products through Vietnam, Malaysia, Mexico, or Canada to dodge US tariffs, Washington's enforcement teams were ready. Rules of origin tightened, certificates double-checked, the loopholes closed one by one. Meanwhile, alternative buyers in Europe, the Middle East, or South America weren't willing to shoulder the higher prices or absorb the same quantity. The American market wasn't just China's biggest buyer. It was their anchor, their stabilizer. Without it, the entire system began to wobble. One logistics executive from Shenzhen admitted anonymously, "We thought we could shift some of our business to Europe, but the orders weren't there. The specs were different, the prices were lower, and the volumes were nowhere near what we needed to keep the factories running." The result? Unsold inventory stacking up, storage costs skyrocketing, loan payments coming due on equipment that now sits idle. The choke point wasn't just at the ports or the borders. It was inside the very bones of the supply chain itself. China could flood the market with products, but it couldn't pivot, couldn't adapt, not fast enough, not at the scale required. The truth Beijing never wanted to admit is now undeniable. The American buyer wasn't just one customer out of many. The American buyer was the foundation. Without that foundation, the world's factory is trapped inside its own machine. Locked in, nowhere to go. The machines are still there. The factory floors still shine under fluorescent lights. But the orders? The orders have vanished. Across China's industrial heartland, from Shenzhen to Ningbo to Dongguan, companies that once thrived on American demand are now gasping for air. Their balance sheets tell the story of a system built on one fragile assumption: that the American buyer would always be there. But now that buyer has walked away, and corporate China is breaking. Let's start at the top. China's biggest exporters, the powerhouse manufacturers who fueled the country's rise as the world's factory, are facing losses they never planned for. Electronics giants, plastics producers, furniture makers, packaging companies, all scrambling to find buyers, all staring at warehouses filled with products they can't move. In 2024, according to data from the China Chamber of Commerce for import and export volumes to the United States fell by over 40% in key sectors like electronics and consumer goods. For many firms, the U.S. was not just a major market, it was the market. Without it, the numbers don't work. And the result is brutal. Layoffs across multiple industries, hiring freezes, loan defaults, production lines mothballed, suppliers left unpaid. One executive at a mid-sized electronics manufacturer in Guangdong put it bluntly in an interview with Reuters: "We lost nearly half our U.S. business after the tariffs. We tried to pivot to Europe and Southeast Asia, but the volume isn't there. We have warehouses full of unsold stock and no plan B." It's not just the big names. Thousands of small and medium-sized enterprises, the subcontractors, component makers, logistics providers, are feeling the squeeze. These are the companies that supply the nuts, bolts, and circuit boards that feed the larger factories. And when the orders stop, their cash flow stops. In 2024 alone, more than 1,500 small manufacturing firms in Guangdong province filed for bankruptcy, a 30% increase from the previous year. Many cited unpaid invoices and collapsed export contracts as the primary cause. Banks are tightening credit. Lenders, nervous about the exposure of their loan portfolios to the export sector, are pulling back. Lines of credit once easy to secure are now frozen. Working capital has dried up. And here's where the collapse turns into a vicious cycle. As exporters lose revenue, they can't pay their suppliers. The suppliers, in turn, can't pay their own vendors. The financial chain that holds China's industrial ecosystem together begins to unravel, link by link. Meanwhile, inventories keep rising. In Shenzhen alone, storage facilities report that capacity utilization hit record highs by mid-2024. Goods are piling up: consumer electronics, machine parts, plastic goods, all waiting for buyers who aren't coming. To keep the lights on, some companies have resorted to desperate measures, selling products below cost just to free up warehouse space, slashing wages and cutting worker hours to reduce expenses, offering steep discounts to clients in smaller, less stable markets, often at a loss. But the more they cut prices, the worse the problem becomes. Because dumping goods on secondary markets only floods the system, driving down global prices further. It doesn't solve the core issue. There is no replacement for the scale of the American consumer. The leadership inside many of these companies is facing a reality they never planned for. The strategy was always growth through volume, and volume meant America. No contingency plan, no flexibility, just a bet that the demand would never dry up. And now, that bet has failed. One sourcing manager at a large electronics supplier admitted, "We built our entire business around the U.S. customer. All our tooling, our certifications, our supply chain, it's all tied to their standards. We can't just flip a switch and start selling elsewhere. It doesn't work like that." This is the corporate choke point. Not a supply chain problem, a demand problem, a structural dependency so deep that when the American buyer steps away, the entire machine seizes up. And it's not just about losing business. It's about losing leverage. Because now, these companies aren't negotiating contracts. They're begging for orders. Desperate exporters are lining up at trade shows in Dubai, Jakarta, and Sao Paulo, offering rock-bottom prices, hoping, pleading. But those markets aren't big enough. They aren't stable enough. And they aren't willing to pay what the Americans paid. The world's factory is discovering the hard way that size alone doesn't guarantee survival. Because when the buyer holds all the power and the buyer walks away, the seller is left with nothing. This isn't just a slowdown, it's a corporate free fall. And the question every CEO in China's export sector is now asking is chilling. How long can we survive without America? The factories are shutting down. The cargo ships are anchored offshore, empty. But the real collapse is happening on the streets. It's the workers, not the CEOs, not the government officials, who are paying the price for China's broken export model. Across the industrial zones of Guangdong, Zhejiang, and Jiangsu, migrant workers are being sent home. No severance, no warning, just a cold message from the factory gates. There are no more orders. There is no more work. This is the other side of the tariff wall. While Beijing scrambles to negotiate deals and cut backroom tariffs on American goods, the labor force that built China's rise is now being left behind. The men and women who filled the factory lines, packed the shipping containers, ran the trucks and the forklifts, they're the first to fall. In Dongguan, known as one of the beating hearts of China's manufacturing zone, Entire dormitory blocks sit half-empty. Young men who once crowded the city's cheap restaurants and factory floors are now packing up their lives, heading back to rural villages with no jobs and no prospects. But the countryside offers no refuge. These workers left their homes because there was no work to begin with. They went to the cities chasing the promise of steady wages and a better life for their families. Now they're returning home broke. Their families still waiting, still depending on the money that no longer arrives. In Sichuan province, one laid-off worker told a local reporter, "I worked in the factory for 6 years. My wife and children stayed in the village. Every month I sent money home, but now the factory is closed. I don't know what to do." Multiply that story by millions. The National Bureau of Statistics in China may report a 20% youth unemployment rate, but off the record, economists warn the real number could be far higher. And among migrant laborers, the figures are even more brutal, because many are never counted in the official statistics once they leave the cities. And as the layoffs spread, so does the social strain. In Shenzhen, there have already been reports of isolated protests outside shuttered factories. Workers demanding back pay, demanding the wages they were promised before the collapse. Some of these protests have been quietly suppressed by local authorities. Others are ignored, left to fizzle out as frustration boils into silence. But the resentment remains, because these workers know exactly who's getting hurt. It's not the corporate executives who gambled on the American buyer. It's not the Communist Party elites who secured the deals. It's the working men and women at the bottom of the chain. They're the ones watching their lives fall apart. In Yiwu, a city famous for its small manufacturing shops and export markets, hundreds of small business owners have closed down their stalls. The customers are gone. The bulk buyers from the US have disappeared. The products sit unsold, gathering dust. In Wenzhou, small suppliers who make parts for larger factories are collapsing. Many of these family-run operations took out loans to expand their capacity during the boom years. Now, they're left staring at unpaid invoices and interest payments they can't meet. The chain reaction continues. Workers laid off, wages unpaid, small shops shuttered, families going without. And behind the statistics is a psychological collapse, a slow erosion of the belief that the system would always deliver. The promise of China's rise was built on the back of its working class, the men and women who sacrificed stability for the hope of progress. Now they're the ones watching the machine seize up and die. And here's the brutal irony. While Beijing stands at the podium, boasting about self-reliance and economic strength, these workers know the truth. They know that the factories they depended on were never built on domestic demand. They were built for one customer, one market, America. The American buyer was the engine that kept the lights on. Without those orders, the collapse doesn't stop at the factory gates. It spreads to the streets, to the homes, to the family dinner tables where parents explain to their children why there's no money this month. This is not just an economic war. This is a social breakdown, a human collapse. And the people feeling it the hardest? They're not in the boardrooms. They're on the factory floor. They're the forgotten soldiers of China's export empire. It started with tariffs, but now it's something much bigger. China is no longer just facing lost orders. It's facing something far more dangerous: abandonment. For decades, the world was locked into China. Global supply chains flowed through its ports. Western corporations flooded its factories with contracts. Trade ministries lined up in Beijing, eager to secure market access. But that era is ending, and Beijing can feel it. Because when the American buyer walked away, it didn't just cause a trade imbalance. It sent a signal to the rest of the world. China is no longer the safe bet it once was. From Tokyo to Berlin to New Delhi, the message is spreading. And the response has been swift. Japan launched a $2.2 billion fund to bring manufacturing out of China and back home. South Korea offered subsidies for firms relocating to Southeast Asia. The European Union began tightening its investment screening mechanisms, quietly signaling growing suspicion about Chinese involvement in critical infrastructure. And the United States? It didn't stop at tariffs. Under the Trump administration, the U.S. weaponized leverage, not by force but by law. New rules clamp down on Chinese companies operating in sensitive sectors. Semiconductor exports were restricted. American firms were warned. Diversify or lose support. And now the ripple effect is global. Vietnam is booming not because of new demand, but because it's taking China's place. So is Mexico, India, even Eastern Europe. Supply chains are rerouting. Trade flows are shifting. China was supposed to be irreplaceable. Now it's being replaced. In 2024, according to Bloomberg Intelligence, foreign direct investment, FDI, into China hit a 30-year low. For the first time in decades, more money flowed out than in. Global firms, from Apple to Adidas, quietly moved capacity elsewhere. Not just for price, for safety, because it's no longer just about cost efficiency. It's about risk. And China is now the risk. The collapse of its export model exposed more than an economic weakness. It exposed the political vulnerability that comes with over-centralization, censorship, and opaque rules. Multinationals are tired of uncertainty. They want reliability, and China can't offer it anymore. But the isolation goes beyond the boardroom. Diplomatically, Beijing is losing friends fast. Countries once eager to sign Belt and Road deals are backing away. Kenya, Sri Lanka, Malaysia, all rethinking their ties after seeing the debt, the delays, the dysfunction. In Africa, Chinese infrastructure projects are under fire. Roads that crack, ports that fail, promises unkept. The trust is gone. And America is stepping in, offering alternative financing, cleaner terms, transparent contracts. In Europe, lawmakers are openly debating China's role in critical supply chains. The sentiment has shifted. Strategic dependence is no longer acceptable. Even within China's own region, allies are drifting. The Philippines is strengthening military ties with the US. Japan is deepening trade with India. Taiwan, once seen as vulnerable, now stands at the center of global semiconductor resilience, backed by Western support. China is being fenced in not with barbed wire but with strategy. Soft power is failing. Economic coercion is backfiring. Global narratives are shifting. And behind the scenes, Beijing knows it. That's why they're quietly lowering tariffs on US goods. Why they're begging American chipmakers to maintain licensing. Why they're sending envoys to Europe, promising market access and mutual benefit. But the charm offensive is too late. Because the world now understands. China doesn't just produce exports. Produces instability. And if the global economy is built on predictability, on trust, then China is no longer qualified. The world's factory is becoming the world's liability. And here's the strategic twist. This collapse didn't happen because of war or sanctions. It happened because one buyer, the biggest buyer, decided to walk away. The United States didn't need missiles. It just needed discipline. Trump's tariff wall didn't just hurt China. It exposed the truth that global dependence on a single authoritarian regime was a fatal flaw. Now that flaw is being corrected. And China is being left behind. As factories sit full. As ports run empty. As trade deals fall flat. This isn't just economic pain. This is geopolitical isolation. The kind that reshapes empires. And for the first time in decades, the world is no longer asking, how can we do business with China? It's asking, how quickly can we get out? China spent decades building its export empire on one simple bet. America will always buy. But now that bet has failed. The factories stand ready. The ports are open. The machines are still humming. But the orders are gone. And behind the speeches about self-reliance and national strength, Beijing is quietly cutting deals, slashing tariffs, begging for parts and buyers to keep the machine alive. This was never just about trade. It was about control. And when the buyer walks away, the seller is left with nothing. So here's the real question. Is this just a temporary setback for China? Or are we witnessing the first true collapse of the world's factory? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe, because this story isn't over.